Welcome back. So now that we've gotten the hang of applying transformations to a single dataset, it's time to explore some methods for combining multiple datasets into one. The first method we'll look at is called merging. Merging combines columns from two different datasets, effectively making the resulting combined dataset wider, so to speak. Merging requires that the individual rows of each respective dataset be associated or tied together in some way. That's how we're able to pull the values in columns from both datasets together in the same row. This is done using a field that each dataset has in common, often some kind of ID, but also quite commonly a date or even a name. Now, if this sounds anything like a VLOOKUP function to you, you're right on. It basically is, albeit a more powerful one with far more options for customization. And in fact, our example is going to demonstrate how merge queries in Power Query can be a superior alternative to VLOOKUP, especially when you want to pull in more than one field from your second dataset. So the first step in our example is going to be to pull in the second dataset, which has data that we're trying to combine with our main home sale dataset right here. Now, if we actually close out of our Power Query editor, we'll see that our workbook has a new tab called Customer Data. Now, this Customer Data worksheet contains information, not surprisingly, about our customers, more information that was contained in our master dataset. For example, for each customer ID, we have the customer's email, their phone number, their age, and their income. Now, if we go back to our primary home sale dataset, we see that we do have a customer ID column and then a customer name, but nothing else. So our goal will be to pull in those additional fields about customers into our home sale dataset. Now, the key here, literally and figuratively, is this customer ID column. That's how we're going to associate individual rows between these datasets with each other. So take, for example, the first customer listed in our home sale dataset with customer ID 208. If we go over to our customer data worksheet, we find on row 8 this same customer ID. So in our final output, these values for this particular customer, this email address, this phone number, this age, this income, will be added on the same row as that same customer ID in our master dataset. So now that we understand what we're trying to do, let's go back into the Power Query editor and merge these two datasets together. So to get back into Power Query, I'll again go to Get Data and then launch Power Query Editor. And now to be able to work with my customer's dataset in the Power Query Editor, I'm going to have to add it as a query. Now up to this point, we've been using Power Query to access external data sources, data that lives outside of the workbook we're currently in. But you can also build queries against datasets that live right here in the very same workbook. And we do that exactly how we would connect to an external data source. At the top right of the Home tab, I'll click the New Source button, and then hover over File, and then Excel Workbook. And then we just navigate to wherever in our file system our current Excel workbook is located, and then we select that workbook and click Import. And it so happens that our customer data is stored in a table named customer_data. So we'll select that object and then take a quick look at the preview of the data, which looks good. So it looks like we can click OK. And now we have our customer data available to work with in the same way that we've been working with our home sale dataset. Now to merge these together, my first step will be to select my main dataset, the one that I'm merging this data into, and that's obviously our home sale dataset. And now, still in the Home tab, I'll hit the Merge Queries button. And here, we'll have to specify the two datasets we want to merge together, and then tell Power Query how we're going to merge those datasets. So because we already had selected our home sale dataset, that one's already appearing in the dialog box. So now we have to specify the other dataset that we want to merge into our home sale dataset. And that's obviously our customer dataset. So to specify that, I'll just click this drop-down box and then choose Customer Data. Now the next step is to tell Power Query the column that these datasets have in common, which is what we're going to use to link them together row by row so we can take the values in all the columns from both datasets for a particular ID and then combine them on a single line or row in our merged dataset. So obviously that column is Customer ID, so I'll select that for our home sale dataset, and then I'll also select that for our customer dataset. Next, we need to specify the type of join being used. This is the method by which Power Query is going to tie these two datasets together row by row. Now the default kind, which is the most common and which functions the most like VLOOKUP, is a left outer join. Now if you're familiar with SQL at all, this works exactly like a left join in SQL. Basically, our output is going to contain all the rows from our first dataset, and then any rows from our second dataset where there was a match on that customer ID field. But if there was a customer ID in our main dataset that didn't exist in our customer dataset, we're just going to see blank or null values in the columns we're pulling in from our customer data. And if you look at the very bottom of the dialog box, Power Query has already identified that our selection matches 160 of 161 rows from the first table. Now that means that out of 161 customer IDs in our home sale dataset, there were 160 matches found in our customer dataset. So there's one missing. So in a second, we're going to see how that looks in our output. So let's go ahead and click OK. And now we have this rather bizarre column called Customer Data that has a bunch of values that say table. So what does this mean? Well, by default, Power Query isn't going to automatically pull in all columns from that second dataset. It actually lets us cherry pick which ones we want to keep. So to see that list of columns that's available for us to pull in, all we have to do is click this little button to the right of the column header, and now we see a list of all the columns from that customer dataset. So we already have customer ID in our home sale dataset, and we know it's going to be the same on any given row because that's how we were able to pull in the customer data to begin with. So we'll uncheck that, but I think we'll go ahead and keep these other four. And then we can click OK. And now if we scroll to the right, we see that we've pulled in the email field, the phone number, the age, and the income. Now contrast this with VLOOKUP, which, while it does something similar, requires you to write a column full of VLOOKUP formulas for every single column of data you want to pull in from your secondary dataset. Yuck. But what about that ID from our home sale dataset that was missing from our customer dataset? Well, if we scroll down through our data, all the way down in this last row, we see the word null in all four columns that we pulled in from that customer dataset. But if we scroll across to the left, we have normal data values from our main home sale dataset. So this is how that left outer join we chose handles cases where the value we're using to tie the two datasets together exists in the main dataset, but doesn't exist in the secondary dataset. Now there's another way to handle this case, which is called an inner join. Now with the inner join, if a match isn't found in the secondary dataset, the row won't show up at all. So the only difference between what we did here and the inner join is that this row, this last row that has nulls from our customer data and values in our home sale data, would not be here at all because there was no match in the customer dataset. And just to prove that to you, I'll actually modify our merged query step by selecting it and then hitting our little gear icon here. And now instead of choosing a left outer join, I'll choose an inner join, which, as Power Query says, means only matching rows. And then before I click OK, take note of the fact that our dataset currently has 161 rows, but we now know that we only have 160 matches out of those 161 rows. So if I click OK, now we see that we only have 160 rows. And then to see our columns from the customer dataset expanded, we just need to select the next step in the process, which we already performed the last go around. So now scrolling across, if we go all the way down to the bottom of our dataset we see that that row of data that had nulls from our customer dataset is gone. And with it is the row of data from our home sale dataset, which had the customer ID that was missing from our customer dataset. So now you might be wondering, which one of these techniques should you use? From my experience, the vast majority of the time, the left outer join is what you'll want. Because normally you're perfectly content to pull in whatever matches happen to exist from a secondary dataset, but you don't want to lose visibility into any of the rows in your primary dataset. But if your situation does call for only returning rows where there's a match on both sides of that join, then inner join is what you'll want to opt for. Now before we move on, a quick word of caution. With the data modeling tools Excel now puts at our disposal, merging datasets in the way we've just seen isn't always our best option. In fact, as we'll see later, it's often best to keep these datasets physically separate and then let Excel link them together behind the scenes, so to speak, so we can combine them on demand in analytical reporting. But in cases where you just need to tack some columns from one dataset onto another in the same way that you would with a VLOOKUP, merge queries can be a great option. Okay, up next we're going to look at another way of combining multiple datasets that complements merging by allowing us to combine datasets vertically, not horizontally. I'll see you then.